You guys can have a seat. Thank you, guys. What a team, huh? I met their leader. They're pretty good in spite of that guy. But anyways, I am incredibly honored and humbled to not just be able to work here at Ascent Church, but I'm incredibly humbled and honored to be able to be a part of what God is doing here. He is growing this community at Ascent Church tremendously. And I'm not just talking about numerically, although he's doing that too, but I'm talking about the growth that has happened here with people stepping up to serve in ways that they've never done before. I'm talking about us growing closer to one another. Just the family that we really do have here at Ascent Church. I know that outside of my family, I have so many people here that I can depend on and count on just like a family should. And that's what God is doing here at Ascent Church. And I am so proud to be able to do that and as part of this movement here. If you haven't met me, my name is Logan Alsup. I'm one of the pastors here. I do the worship ministry and the student ministry. We've had a kind of a bizarre week. If you haven't heard yet, we got struck by lightning on Wednesday at the church. I was the only one here at the time. I was sitting in my office working on my message. But that was a joke, by the way. I wasn't really. That game's too hard. But anyways, no, I was sitting in my office, and I'm not sure what an atomic bomb sounds like, but I'm pretty sure that lightning strike sounds pretty close, because this big boy was on the ceiling, okay? And we had a loud, explosion sound, and then a bunch of stuff didn't work after that. And so we got struck by lightning on Wednesday, and so if you were here Wednesday night, you know that the sound system was going crazy. We did get a loaner system from another church. We've kind of just started pulling back the string of the effects of this lightning strike. And so if you're like, hey, this sounds different, that's because it is. And we got struck by lightning. We found out today that our main keyboard got fried. We've got audio boxes fried. We got all sorts of stuff happening here. So just bear with us as we kind of navigate this and try to get it back to some type of normalcy. But with that being said, I want to just commend the team that we have here because this week was crazy because Pastor Jason and his wife, Christina, and their family are on vacation. They watched in first service, which means we get to do whatever we want in this service. But they watched in first service, and they're enjoying some time away. They'll be back soon, so you only have to put up with me for a little bit. But with them being gone, my wife was sick. We got struck by lightning. Everything didn't work. It's been a chaotic week, but this team, the worship team, the tech team, the staff, everybody has just jumped in and made today possible, which yesterday wasn't looking so good. So that's awesome, awesome, awesome. We took a break last week from the Pilgrim series. We're going to continue on in that break. But when Pastor Jason returns soon, then we're going to dive in back into that Pilgrim series. So don't lose everything that we started in the Pilgrim series. We're going to come back to that. Today, I want to talk about something that has really been just kind of on my heart lately, and Pastor Jason asked me to speak. This is one of the things that I kind of, you always wrestle with. What do you speak on? Especially if nobody gives you a topic. You're like, okay, God, what do you have for me? What do you have for this church today? And so what we have today is something that I've really been spending a lot of time in over the last few years. And this message today is called "You Can't Fake the Harvest." And this is just a concept that has been really cool and really, I don't even know the word I'm looking for, but it's been great for me to grow on and to learn more about as I've dove into this. And it comes from a passage in Galatians But the kind of the root of this is the harvest being an agricultural term. Now, I'm from a rural town in southeast Missouri. I would tell you what it's called, but you wouldn't remember it, and it's not important. But where I'm from is a farming town. It's a little bitty agricultural town, and we hear words like sowing and reaping and harvest and all of this stuff, and we don't bat an eyelash because it's super common to us. One thing I know about Florida is that, like, there's 7 people from Florida here, and everybody else is from New York. I mean, that's just how it is. And she's like, no, I'm not. I'm from Michigan. Okay, sorry. I forgot the couple Michigan people, too. And I know we got Pennsylvania. First service we had Las Vegas. We got Missouri. We got everything. Florida is like the giant melting pot of the United States. And so one of the things that I is not lost on me when I'm trying to think of examples and things to relate things to is that I could talk about snow, and not everybody knows what snow looks like. And I could talk about agriculture, but not everybody grew up in a town where agriculture was prevalent. And so we're going to talk about that today. And if you don't know agriculture, that's fine. Like I said, the town I grew up in, we named our high school formal Cotton Blossom, because we're really creative with terms in Missouri, and that's when the cotton blooms, so that's what they named the dance. It happens every year in the fall. That's when the cotton blooms. Hey, let's name the dance that. Sure, all right, write it down, end of meeting. It's not uncommon where I'm from for you to be 30 minutes late to work because you got stuck behind a combine. For my friends from New York, a combine is, well, it's a big, slow tractor. We're just going to call it a big, slow tractor, okay? I don't want to confuse you, I know. And you laugh at that, but there was like 3 or 4 people after first service that came up and said, I don't know what a combine is. And one of them was my wife, and she's from there, so. But that's okay. If you don't know what a combine is, this message is still for you. But the reason that I put so much emphasis on this is because so many times throughout Scripture, we have a concept in the Bible that doesn't have anything to do with really anything except it related to these people. And so many of the biblical writers, including Jesus when he spoke, took a concept that was super relatable to people, and then they used that to define what the kingdom of heaven is like, or a principle that he wants us to follow is like. And these relatable things like agriculture, because these people were from a place probably not unlike where I'm from, where everybody was farming, everybody knew what the harvest was, and so he said, hey, it's like the harvest, and you can't fake the harvest. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And excuse me, sorry. But the idea of the harvest comes from this other idea of sowing and reaping, and that's really what the text that we're going to be in today talks about. And sowing and reaping, again, a couple agricultural terms that if you're not in or around that, maybe these terms are lost on you. And so I was thinking about it, okay, what is sowing and reaping? Like, what are some everyday terms that mean the same thing? And what I came up with, we deal with this concept every single day, and maybe we call it something different, like cause and effect. All of us are familiar with the concept of cause and effect. For every cause, for every effect, there is a cause. And there can't be an effect if there's no cause. In other words, something doesn't happen from nothing. For every effect, there's a cause. And it's the same thing with sowing and reaping. And the idea that Paul's going to drive home here is that you cannot reap what you do not sow. And so, again, cause and effect. And what we are going to be talking about today is from Galatians chapter 6. And what Paul does in this is in the letter that he writes to Galatia, he starts off in the first few chapters, and he's very vague, but then he's like, okay, I'm getting to the end of this letter. I'm going to really drive home some practical applications for these guys. And then we get to chapter 6, and he's going to talk about some things like how we relate and being accountable to one another, and how we be accountable to God. And then when he gets to verse 6, he's going to talk about the idea of sowing and reaping, but he does it in kind of 3 parts. And those are the things that we're going to look at today. And the first thing that he does is he gives a concept. He also gives an example, and then he gives us a motivation. So he's going to talk about, this is what you're doing. Here's an example of doing that, and this is why you should do it. And we've talked about the why in here before several times and how your why should drive your what. And so that's what he does, is he talks about the what, he gives an example, and then he explains the why. Okay? And so we're going to get into these points in just a minute. Before we do that, let's read the text. It comes from Galatians chapter 6, verses 6 through 10. It says, "Let the one who has taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. And do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows up to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are in the household of faith." So we're going to dive into these points. Before we do that, I want to pray one more time. Father God, I just pray that as we dig into your word, that you would speak to us where we need to be spoken to. God, that we would hear what we need to hear, and that we would do what you call us to do. So God, be with us through this message. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So the first point that we want to talk about is the concept. This is the what. What is Paul telling us to do here? And so what he does is, and this is in verse 7 and 8, and so we go a little bit out of order here, but I think that for us, it's important to explain what we're doing before we give the example. So in verses 7 and 8, again, he says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever someone sows, he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit, you will from the Spirit reap eternal life." So Paul's going to give an example again, of taking care of those who pour into you. And we'll come back to that, but immediately after that example, he comes in and says, "Don't be deceived. God is not mocked." So I thought about that. Like, what does it mocking God look like? Like, what is that? What would make Paul say that we would be deceived in thinking that we can mock God? I'll tell you what I think it is it boils down to selfishness. Now, selfishness is a word that is thrown around a lot. I mean, like a whole lot. And, we use it to discipline people. Like my children, that's a word I throw to my kids a lot. I'm like, this is selfishness, and you're being selfish, and you need to stop being selfish. And so when I'm disciplining my children, I really try to drive home the fact that, you're doing this because of selfishness. And I want them to understand, like, hey, look, you got to think about other people. It's not just about you. And so when I'm disciplining my children, I'm really trying to, step them out of self. And so that's one way that we use selfishness. I think one way that we use selfishness is in manipulation. And I don't think that anybody wants to call it that, and nobody wants to admit that. But one way that we kind of do it is that one selfish person will try to get what they want from another selfish person by calling them selfish. And it's like, hey, I know I'm being selfish here, but you're being selfish by withholding that thing that I want to be selfish about. I told him to count how many times I said selfishness in first service. If I get to 100, everybody gets a trophy. So I'm just kidding. Some people are like, why would we get a trophy for that? Some people are way too literal. Anyways, but we use that kind of manipulation factor because we want something, they have something, and so I'm going to point out that they're being selfish by not giving that thing to me, even though I'm being selfish by wanting that in the first place. And so that's another way that we kind of throw out the selfishness. It's used as an excuse. It gets thrown around a lot for all these different reasons. But I think what we mean here, what Paul means here is this. When Paul says God is not mocked, he says, don't fool yourself. You cannot reap what you have not sown. It reminds me of a selfishness of how we oftentimes will portray ourselves to others and to God. And what I mean by this is we all know someone who likes to appear a certain way, right? We all know somebody who likes to appear really, really busy. And when we think about that for a second, it's like we know somebody because we are that somebody. And we really, really, really like to look certain ways to certain people. Like if you're at work and your boss is coming by, I've got to look busier than I actually am, or else they're going to ask me to do something that I don't want to do. All right? I got to hold the clipboard. I got to, whatever it is, I've got to appear to be busier so that they don't ask me to do more. All right? We do it at work. We do it at home, fellas. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. That guy. Anyway. No, we do it at home. Husbands, how many times has your wife told you to do something, but you can't because you're just too busy? But really, you just don't want to. I saw a video the other day. This is pretty good. This husband, I guess his wife had given him like a honey-do list, and she's like, hey, you need to do this and this. And he's like, well, I'm going to go fix the bathroom. And so he goes into the bathroom, and he brings his tools and all that. And then I guess like 30 minutes go by, and his wife's like, what is taking him so long? What is he doing? So she starts filming, and she goes back there. And what had happened was he had put Monday Night Football on his iPad, and he was sitting in the floor of the bathroom with the Monday Night Football on the toilet, but he had these tools with him. So every now and then, he would like make the tool noises while he's watching Monday Night Football, and his wife comes by like, what are you doing? And he's like, oh man. And some guys in here are like, shh, stop right now. You're giving away my secrets, but I'm looking at you, Josh. But anyways, we like to portray ourselves certain ways to certain people. And it's not always busyness. But I think that's a big one. And listen, I'm not trying to say that we're not busy. I get that. I believe wholeheartedly that the world's spinning faster and we're cramming more stuff into our schedules than ever before. So I get it that we're busy. I know that we're busy, but the thing is that we have the same 24 hours now that the disciples had then. And we have the same 24 hours now that we did when we were 6. We have the same 24 hours as they do. And just because we fill it with all sorts of stuff doesn't change, what we're called to do. But we like to portray ourselves as, I'm too busy to do that. You can't ask me to do any more. I'm too busy. Listen, I get it. I especially this week, I get it. This week has been insane. We got struck by lightning, and I'm trying to learn how to do things that I don't have a clue what I'm doing. I don't know how to fix a soundboard. I don't know how to, diagnose a keyboard or an irrigation system or a phone line. I don't know how to do any of that. And so I've been running around like crazy this week, and I get it. We're busy. But God also knows how busy we are. The problem in that is that God is not mocked. God is not fooled. The games that we play with ourselves and with others, it doesn't work with God. In other words, we try to make ourselves appear a certain way to other people. We try to convince ourselves certain things about ourselves, but it doesn't work for God. God sees right through it. He's, God, I'm busy. Okay? You played Candy Crush for 6 hours. God, I'm too broke. You went to Starbucks 7 times today. 7 times. God, I got these deadlines. Yeah, but you're all caught up on Yellowstone. And we play these games with other people, and it's like, hey, I'm too busy to do that. Okay, no problem. We convince ourselves, you're too busy, you can't do that. Okay, yeah, I'm too busy. And then when we do that to God, God says, It doesn't work that way. Why? Because God is not mocked. And here's the kicker. You can't mock God, but what you can't do is you cannot fake the harvest. You can't do it. What you sow, you will reap. Your effect is always a direct result of your cause. Because the truth is that sometimes we make excuses for why we didn't do what God called us to do, but we still want to portray that we are doing what God called us to do. We try to appear holy before people. When we do actually pray, we try to use words that we think are impressive to God. We try to present ourselves as something that maybe we aren't truly being. And it kind of reminds me of these passages. One's in Isaiah. It's mentioned again in Matthew and then in Ezekiel. But let's look at Isaiah 29. It says, "And the Lord said, because of this, people draw near to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me. And their fear of me is a commandment that's taught by men." In other words, they're doing this because somebody told them to, not because they're coming to God. And then in Ezekiel, this one is great. He says in verse 31, it says, "They come to you as people come, and they sit before you as my people, and they hear the things that you say, but they will not do it. For with lustful talk in their mouths they act, but their heart is set on their gain." Sounds a lot like selfishness, right? And then again, the first passage is repeated in Matthew, but it's a little bit different. He starts off in verse 7, and he says, "You hypocrites." That's how you want to be greeted, right? "Hey, hypocrites." He says, "You hypocrites. Well, did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me? In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" These people, they come and they draw near to God with their lips, and they sit in here as people do. They hear the things that are said, but they won't do them because it's just talk, and they don't act. Their heart is set on their gain. It's selfishness, and they honor God with their lips, but their heart is far away from God. We look like a follower of Jesus. We raise our hands like a follower of Jesus. We sing and we do all these things that we're supposed to do, but where is our heart? I can give you some insight as the worship pastor here. I can tell you with 100% certainty, God doesn't care where your hands are. They can be up here, they can be down here, they can be picking your nose. He doesn't care. But where is your heart? God doesn't care how many fancy words you can memorize. I used exegesis in a Bible study the other day with Josh. I went to Bible college. That word was drilled into my head. What does it mean? Who cares? All right? He didn't care when I used it in class. I don't know. It's just like word vomit. It just came out. It meant nothing to anyone. And sometimes we use these words because we think it's impressive to God. If my vocabulary is fancy, if I pray a certain way, if I say a certain thing, then people will look at me and say, "That guy is holy. That guy is close to God." And God's like, "That guy don't know me." Because he comes at me with fancy words, with meaningless repetitions, with his hands wherever. I don't know that guy. Where's his heart? Where is his heart? That's what God is saying, and that's what these passages, they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. I could bring in the best singers with the best presentation. The best speakers could come up here with the best, most articulate words. But God says, "Look, I'm looking at your heart, and I want to know where that is, and all that other stuff. Who cares? If it impresses the person down the row from you, cool. You got some fancy words, you can memorize a dictionary. Good for you. Where's your heart at?" And the students, we have a phrase called Jesus juking, and I hate it. I hate it. What I mean by this is I'll ask a question. I'll be like, "Hey, what is something that you're struggling with right now?" And they'll raise their hand and say, "I only prayed 3 times today." And I'm like, "Shut up. Go read a book, okay? Like what's real? Like what is that struggle that's real? What are you hiding from everybody else?" Guess what? God knows it already. And so we're trying to be real. If your struggle is that you've only prayed 3 times this week, I'd say you're doing pretty good. If your struggle is that, oh, well, I only memorized it in Hebrew, I haven't gotten Latin yet. Okay, who cares? No, struggles are real, and people are real, and these words are real. And God says, I want to know what's real. You know where that's found? Right here. Right there. And everything else on the outside is just icing on the cake. And I don't even like icing. Ask Athena. She makes the best cakes in the world, and I won't eat them because they got icing on them. But my point is that it doesn't matter. It's just vanity, you know. In the Old Testament, it's vanity of vanity. All things are vanity. What he's saying is all of these things, they don't matter. You know what matters? Loving God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. That's what matters. Because when we do that, all this other stuff, it happens. And so, you know, Paul is saying this, and he's saying, look, God is not mocked. You cannot fool God. He sees your heart. But he's saying, look, you cannot reap what you don't sow. You cannot fake the harvest. When I was in college, I changed my major a few times. I ended up landing on kind of basically like athletic training. It's called kinesiology, but that was probably the hardest part of my degree is learning how to say kinesiology. And so, but it's like athletic training, and it's like exercise science and that kind of stuff. But I had this passion for sports, right? And I had this like drive in me, and I played 3 sports in high school for so long, and there's some other coaches in the room. You know, like when you get that bug, like when you have this passion for something, you get that bug, like you don't walk away from that really easily. And so when I was in college, I was like, man, I really love sports, and I really want to continue this on. And so I started working in the training room because that was like my degree. And I was like, okay, I'm getting the degree. I might as well get the experience, right? And so the head basketball coach comes in one day. He had a guy I was taping or something, whatever. And he comes in and he says, hey, I hadn't seen you around much. He said, my name's Jason Shelton. I'm the head basketball coach. I'm like, okay, yeah, I know who you are. Like, and he's like, what are you doing in here? I was like, well, you know, I'm just working. I'm exercise science major, whatever. You know, want to get the experience. He's like, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I don't know. I think I'd really like to coach. He said, so you're working in the training room? I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of the only opportunity I had. And he's like, not anymore. And so then he's like, you're going to work for me. He said, you ever played basketball? I said, I played basketball, yeah. I said, I love. He said, all right, well, you're going to be my new student assistant. Just like that. Like, this guy didn't know me from anybody. And he was just like, all right, you're my new student assistant. And so then, like if you've ever seen like kids who are getting recruited to play a sport, one of the things that's a big deal to these kids is the facilities, right? And so like you get a campus tour, and you're like, okay, yeah, that's cool. It's the program. It's all that. I want to see the locker room. Like that's what these kids want to see. Like I want to see the locker room. I want to see the field. I want to see the court. Like that's what I want to see. And it's a big deal. And so coach is getting ready to let me into the locker room. And even though I worked in the training room, I had never been in there. So this was like I was getting giddy. It was really cool. I walked in. It was just a room. It was, yeah. It had lockers on it. It's exactly what you would think a locker room would look like. But one of the things that caught my eye is that coach had this thing for like motivational sayings, right? I can quote most of them because he drilled them into our head. But around the locker room, we had all these things, and it said things like others over self. It had things like play hard, smart, and together. And the biggest sign in the room had the title of our message today. You cannot fake the harvest. And I didn't know what that meant. Even though I grew up in the country and we had combines and all that, I didn't know what that meant. So I said, Coach, what does that mean? Why is that the biggest sign in here? He says, okay. He said, say we had a guy who could play basketball, and we stuck him out there in the conference championship. How's he going to do? I said, what do you mean? We just stuck him out there? He hadn't been to practice? He hadn't played with a team? He's like, yeah. He's probably going to get embarrassed. And he said, you're right. He said, why? Well, I said, Coach, he hadn't learned the plays. Coach, he hadn't done in the work. He hadn't been following the diet. He hadn't been working out. He hadn't done any of these things to go out there and win a basketball game. Coach, he doesn't know the other guys. He doesn't know the sets. He doesn't know any of that. He's like, yeah, so what you're saying is you can't get out there and win a basketball game if you haven't put in the work. In other words, you cannot reap what you have not sown. I was like, yeah, Coach, that's exactly what I mean. He said, you can't fake the harvest. If you don't put in the work, if you don't do the steps necessary, I wanted to come up here and have like a cup of dirt, which like was my sixth grade science project. That's what it was. It was like a cup of dirt. I was just hoping the teacher would put an F on it and move on. But she's like explaining. I'm like, never mind. Anyways, but I wanted to bring up a cup of dirt, and then I wanted to put a seed in here, and then just set it up here, and then we could all watch it grow together. Like that would be a really cool example, right? Except what's the problem? It doesn't work that way. It takes time. It takes steps. It takes work. It takes commitment. And if we skip any of those things, the seed doesn't grow. Or you know what would be even cooler is if I came up here and I planted like a sunflower seed, but then we could get like watermelon. Like that would be really cool, right? It's kind of like pick your own adventure, seed edition. It's like, okay, I'm going to plant this seed, and I pick a cheeseburger tree. Is that a thing? I hope so. All right. I'm not a gardener, but I'm really hoping that that's out there. But anyways, no, it doesn't work that way. Because the same thing is you can't reap what you don't sow. You also, you got to put in the work. You got to do all that. But whatever you plant, that's what's going to come out. In all of my years of driving past cotton fields and cornfields and bean fields, I've never driven past a bean field that had corn in it. Not once. I've never driven past a cornfield that had cotton in it. Not once. Why? Because you cannot fake the harvest. Whatever you sow, that's what you're going to reap. And point number 2, we're going to get an example from Paul. So we went a little bit out of order. So we're going to go back to verse 6 to get the example from Paul here. And in verse 6, Paul starts off and he says, he talks about sowing and reaping. But then he goes in and he says, let the one who has taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches it. Now this is one of those verses that as a pastor, as someone who teaches, I'm like, I don't want to teach on that. That seems like weird and self-serving. It's like I'm telling people, hey, guys, let the ones who's being sown into, that's you, take care of the ones who's sowing into you. All right, guys, who's buying me lunch? Like that's what it feels like. And so I was like, I don't really want to teach on that. That feels weird. And then I stumbled across this quote by Martin Luther. And what he said was, these passages are all meant to benefit us as ministers, but I must say I do not find much pleasure in explaining these verses. I am made to appear as if I'm speaking for my own benefit. But the thing that really stuck with me is Martin Luther goes on to write, he says, I have often wondered why all of the apostles reiterated this request with such embarrassing frequency. We have come to understand why it is so necessary to repeat the admonition of this verse. When Satan cannot suppress the preaching of the gospel by force, he tries to accomplish his purpose by striking the ministers of the gospel with poverty. In other words, one of the ways that Satan tries to discourage the spreading of the gospel is by eliminating the support for the ones who spread it. And I think it's critical to point out that while most often when we talk about support, we immediately go to financial, and that is one way to support someone, but not the only way. There are so many ways to support the ones that pour into you, not just pastors, but everyone who pours into you. Things like prayer, things like encouragement, sending a letter. I think one of the biggest ones is being understanding. Knowing that the people that stand up here like Pastor Jason, they're people. And when you can understand that they're people, not that ATM machine, then being understanding goes a long way to support those who pour into you. Even, yes, money. We can't do this for nothing. We can't keep the lights on. We can't send people to out in the community. It takes financial efforts. One of the big ways is that you could support the pastor is by going to work in the church here. We've had so many people step up to serve, but there's a huge need for people in the tech booth, for people in the band, for people in children's ministry. There's always that need for people to step up. Do you want to pour into the ones that pour into you? Sign up to serve. And when you sign up to serve, here's an idea: show up. So many people, again, going back to that appearance thing, is like, I'm going to sign the list, but I have no intention of ever following through. That was for you, Jim. So I just wanted to call her Jim from the stage. Inside joke. You'll be a part of one someday. Anyways, that's a huge way that we support someone, is by saying, you know what? Instead of, I'm going to walk through these doors and you pour into me, you say, I'm going to walk through these doors, you pour into me, what can I do to help? Let's do this together. That is a huge way to support the ministry and those who stand up here and do this. Now again, excuse me, I look at this example that Paul gives, and even in the words that Martin Luther wrote, and what I want to kind of explain, and I kind of get to do this because I'm the worship guy and the student guy. I'm not the main guy here, so I kind of get to talk about this where maybe Pastor Jason wouldn't feel released to say this, but I'm going to say it for him, is that the people who stand up here week after week, they don't do it for a paycheck. I don't know if anybody thinks that. Let's not talk crazy. We got to eat. We get a paycheck. We're not hurting for anything. We're not asking for anything. Pastor Jason didn't ask me to say this, but I want you to know that Pastor Jason comes up here week after week because it's a calling, not because he receives a check. Okay? He stands up here week after week and does what he does because God called him to do that. And I have the utmost respect for Pastor Jason, especially knowing what he left and what he gave up to come and follow God. It is absolutely 100% about a calling. If he was in it for a paycheck, he never would have left the engineering job that he had. If it was about a paycheck, I promise you he wouldn't be here. It's about a calling. So many times, and again, just kind of going down this same vein here, I've been in ministry nearly 2 decades, and I've met a lot of people that have done this job. And anybody who's worth their weight in anything, I promise you they're not doing it for a paycheck. They're doing it for a calling, and it's the same across the country. It's the same across denomination. And there are people who seek more than what they should from this stage. But anybody that I know that's worthy of this calling doesn't do it for a paycheck. It's not like we're sitting around the house and you know what would be cool? I'm going to spend hours upon hours upon hours reading and researching and writing and rewriting this message. You know what would be cool is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to stress about how I should deliver it, and then half the people aren't even going to listen. And the other half, they're going to forget it as soon as they walk out the door. And there's going to be at least 10 people who are offended. And they're going to hate me for it. And there's going to be dozens of people who come in and say, you know what? That was over my head, dude. And then there's going to be dozens more who said, you know what? You're not feeding me spiritually enough what I need. There's going to be people who come up after I finish preaching and they're going to say, you know what you should have done, Pastor? Because I know. And you're laughing, but this is true. And it's real. And it happens week after week after week after week after week, and that's just on Sunday. Not to mention through the week where it's countless phone calls and emails and people demanding of your time and of your attention. Not to mention that guy who told you what you should have been doing, Pastor. They're going to come back and say, I told you what to do. Why didn't you do it? Now I'm going to leave the church because I'm offended. And it happens. And oh, by the way, you're going to do all of that and way more, and you're going to get a fraction of what it's actually worth. So you tell me that somebody gets into ministry for a paycheck. Not to mention the guys who come up and say, you only work on Sundays, right? I hate that joke. I really do. People say that to me, and I have to fake the smile, but really I want to punch them in the face. Am I allowed to say that as a pastor? Am I? Okay. I'm just saying. You only work on Sundays and Wednesdays, right? Anyways, no, it's not about a paycheck. It's not about a pedestal. It's not about fame or fortune. It's about a calling. And again, this position is not an easy one. You're going to receive scrutiny on every level from every person. And the people who stand in this position, it cannot, for them and for you, it cannot be about a paycheck. It has to be a calling. And for people like Pastor Jason, and I believe with all of my heart, like I mentioned before, I have a ton of respect for Pastor Jason. And it's about a calling. And yet still, there's people who come in here with the hand out saying, what do you have for me? Or even more so than that, so many people, instead of coming out with a handout saying, how can I help you? They come with a clenched fist saying, what have you done for me? And it goes right back to, you cannot reap where you have not sown. Because Pastor Jason comes up here and sows into you every week. And you reap that. And this example that Paul's talking about is he's saying, hey, look, you're reaping week after week after week. What are you sowing? God's not mocked. You cannot reap where you have not sown. And it's the spiritual ATM. I come in, make a transaction, and I roll out. We ought to be careful how we pour into those that pour into us. And I don't think that that's self-serving. That's God designed. Is that God has called people like Pastor Jason to pour into us week after week after week. What are you pouring into him? What are you pouring into this community at Ascent? What are you pouring into the community out these doors? And, Paul mentions this principle several times, and even in the Corinthians, he talks about how the Lord commanded that those that proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. In other words, God calls those people into ministry, expecting that the ones that he ministers to would support him. They sow into you, you ought to sow into them. Are you only here to reap? Well, Pastor Logan, it's hard. Following God, answering that calling. Sometimes it's hard for me, let alone trying to support someone else. Sometimes it's more than I can handle, and I'm supposed to pour into that guy. No, he's supposed to pour into me. It's hard. I get it. That's why, Paul, and that's why God included point number 3, which is the motivation. Sometimes it's hard to sowing and reaping. Like I said, I grew up around a lot of farmers. You go to talk to a farmer after work, you know what they are? They're tired. Because they woke up before the sun did, and they stayed out until it went down, tending to their fields, doing everything that's necessary so that the crops would grow. So when the time they get back to their homes, they're exhausted. They're tired. They've worked hard. They're sweaty. They're dirty. Even with all the fancy tractors and stuff now that they have, they're still working hard. It's supposed to be hard. I think that's another reason that Paul uses the example of sowing and reaping. Is he's saying, look, it's supposed to be hard, but we know it's going to be hard. So this is what they say in verse 9. Let us not grow weary of doing good. For in due season, or the right time, you will reap if you do not give up. So as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are in the household of faith. And that's the look around. So again, he says, don't grow weary in doing good. At the right time, in due season. And one of the things that Pastor Jason said last week, was really cool because he was talking about in Romans 8 where it says, all things work together for good. And then he kind of expanded on that and said, that doesn't say for good right now. And good doesn't always look the way that it should. And the same thing is true about this passage in Galatians where it says, let's not grow weary in doing good, for in due season. Well, guess what? Due season might look different for God than it does for you. And this doing good, doing what God has called you to do, it's like, well, I was doing good things. I went to church. I checked this list. I did this thing. Okay? The part where it says, let us not grow weary of doing good, it is a pretty big implication there. The implication there is that doing good could make you weary, right? In other words, this warning wouldn't be here if the things that God called you to do weren't hard. Don't grow weary in doing good. It's hard. Yeah, it's supposed to be. Sometimes it hurts. Yeah, I get that. But don't give up. Because at the right time, not your time, but at the right time, you will reap a reward, a harvest, if you do not give up. Doing good, whether that be in ministry like Pastor Jason and myself, and so many people like us, or in all that you do. God's called each of us to something. And here he's called us, maybe he's called you to serve in children's ministry, maybe he's called you to serve in the booth or on this stage. He's called you to something. And we like to appear like we're busy to God, but God's not mocked. But God has called you to something. And when you walk in that calling, it could be a burden sometimes. It could feel like a burden sometimes. And Paul says, don't grow weary in that, because there's a reward coming if you don't give up. But maybe it's not just the church. Maybe it's in your home. And God's called you to be a man and be a father and raise your kids to know Him and to follow Him and to love Him. Maybe He's called you to be a wife to support your kids, to support your husband. He's called each one of us to something. Some people He's called us to multiple things. But just because you're not a father, or just because you're not a husband, or just because you're not a wife, doesn't mean, oh, okay, I'm good. I don't have anything I'm called to. Yes, you do. He's called you to serve here. He's called you to serve in the community. He's called all of us, no matter who you are, to shine His light. Some of us have more than others, but He's called each one of us to do good with what He's called us to do. And when we do that, it could be hard. But you can't fake the harvest. Because when you reap a harvest, if you don't give up, back to that, is you can't fake the harvest. Some people show up when it's harvest time when they never planted the seed in the first place. He says, hey, I didn't give up. I'm here. Yeah, but you didn't do anything before you got here. He said, no, I'm here. I'm here for the reward. You can't fake the harvest. And if you don't sow, you won't reap. And so when He says, don't grow weary in doing good, He's saying, sow. God's not mocked. You can't just show up and say, okay, here we are. That's honoring God with your lips, but your heart is far from you. You can't fake the harvest, but the other thing you can't do is you can't rush it either. And we talked about the process. We talked about the seed. So many times we want to skip steps. The younger brother in the story of the prodigal son teaches us if we get what we want before we're ready for it, we can't handle it. I heard a guy say this one time. He said, the blessing is prepared for the people, but the people need to prepare for the blessing. Why? Because God knows better than we do. Sometimes we just need to shut up and say, okay. It takes intentionality. You can't just say, all right, I'm gonna play basketball today. No, you gotta be intentional. It takes hard work. If you know what's easy, you know what doesn't take any intentionality? Giving up. I'll show you. I give up. That's all it takes. It's an easy button. We're always looking for an easy button. That's the easy button. You give up, that's easy. But then you miss out on what God has in store for you. You're looking for an easy button, it's there. But it doesn't reap the rewards. Why? Because you can't fake the harvest. You can't reap what you don't sow. There's a movie. It's one of my favorite movies. Probably one of the worst acted movies in the history of mankind. But it's a great movie. It's called Facing the Giants. Some of you guys know that movie. You already know what scene I'm talking about. There's a scene in this movie. Basically the movie is about this football coach who his life is kind of in shambles. Things are getting really hard. His car note's way behind. His house note's way behind. He and his wife are trying to get pregnant. She can't get pregnant. And he's just going through the ringer. And he's crying out to God like, what is going on? And he wants to quit. He's like, if I don't quit, I'm going to get fired. But then there's this guy that comes by and he tells them this story about how there's these two farmers who pray desperately for rain. And one of the farmers goes out to the field and he gets the field ready for the rain, and the other farmer, he just keeps praying. He said, which one of those farmers do you think trusted God to bring the rain, to bring the harvest? And the coach goes, the guy who went and prepared the field. He said, yeah. He said, which one are you? And so we went back and he kind of has this, the cheesy scene in the movie where it's like the music's playing and it's like 90s Christian music, so it's terrible. And it's like he's having this moment, and then he says, all right, this is what I'm going to do. So he calls his boys together. He gets the football team. And the boys are sitting there like they've just kind of experienced this culture of losing so long. They're just like, hey, who are we losing to this Sunday, this weekend? He says, oh, okay, you already think you're going to lose. He says, well, maybe not if we knew what the result would be. And so he calls out his leader. There's a kid named Brock. And if you played football, I don't know, it's probably outlawed now because everything that we did growing up is outlawed now in football. But we used to do this thing called a death crawl, and it's insanely hard. And so they show this in the movie. What it is you get on your fingertips and on your toes, and you have to go across the field. But then there's a guy on your back holding on to your shoulder pads while you're doing it. And they're not like balanced up there. They're wobbling. It ain't fun. And so he calls this guy out, and he says, you're the leader of this team. Why don't you come here? And so he calls him up. He says, hey, I want you to do the death crawl. How far do you think you can go? He said, I think I can get to the 30-yard line. He said, oh, I think you can. And the coach tells him, he says, I think you can get to the 50-yard line. He said, maybe I can get to the 50-yard line if nobody was on my back. He says, well, I think you could do it with him on your back, but just in case, he said, I'm going to blindfold you. He said, I'm going to blindfold you so we can eliminate distractions. He said, because I don't want you to give up when you think you've done enough. He said, you're promising me your best. I want you to give me your best. He said, okay. So the kid gets blindfolded. He gets down on his fingertips. He gets down on his toes, and the kid gets on his back, and he starts going. And at first, it's easy, right? At first, it's like, I could do this all day. All right? And then he gets, however far. He's like, all right, how far am I, coach? He says, don't worry about it. Give me your best. Well, come on, I gotta be getting close. He said, just give me your best. Don't worry about it. He said, come on, coach, it's starting to hurt. He said, okay, let it hurt. He said, but he's getting heavy. Then let him be heavy. So how far am I? Don't worry about it. Give me your best. So he goes farther. And then those complaints turned into screams. Coach, I can't go anymore. Coach, I can't do it. It hurts. Then the coach gets down at his level. He gets to where he is, and he gets in his ear. He said, it hurts. He said, then you let it hurt. He's heavy. Let him be heavy. But don't give up on me. He keeps going. And those screams of agony turn into, he collapses. And then these tears. Coach, I can't give anymore. I can't do anymore. I got to be at the 50 now. I got to be. The coach gets down and he lays down there with him. He says, take off your blindfold. You're in the end zone. And he said, this kid who thought, I can only do so much. I can only go to the 30. I'll be pushing myself to get to the 50. I can almost guarantee, having done this myself, that if the blindfold wasn't there, when he got to the 50, he would have stopped at the 50. Because so many times God asks for our best and we give God what is required and nothing more. Why? Because we've reached our destination. We're obsessed with the destination. People all the time, let's talk about end times. Let's talk about end times. I get it. But we are obsessed with the destination. What we have notoriously not been obsessed with is giving God our best. And we reach the destination and say, okay, what more do you want from me? When I was a camp counselor, I got to a point, I had done it 3 or 4 summers, and the greatest job I ever had, including this one, sorry kids. But I was a camp counselor, and I had gotten to a point where I didn't feel like I could give anymore. I was tired. It's hot out there. You're dealing with 200 screaming kids for 8 weeks in the summer. And now I deal with teenagers and musicians, so look, I get it. This is my life. But when I was out there, I'd gotten to a point where I was ready to say, you know what, I don't think I can do this anymore. And one of the cool things that we did at the camp that I worked at is we had this thing, we called it the Warm Fuzzy Board. And it was a place where you could go and you could write encouragements to other people. Most people used it as like the hey, will you go on the hike with me? Hey, will you sit by me during Devo? Like that's what most people used it as. But I walked up to the board one day and I saw one that had my name on it. And listen, I was a college student. I was out there thinking I was a hot shot, thinking had given up my summer for God. And I was burnt out. And I pulled this note off the wall, and they didn't sign it. But on the card it said, while I was burnt out, while I didn't think I could go anymore, I picked up this note and it said, and let us not grow weary in doing good. For at the right time you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. I later found out who wrote that. It was actually a mentor of mine's wife. And she had seen that I had hit that point in my life where I wanted to throw in the towel. And I believe wholeheartedly that God sent her to write that. And it's interesting because when we get to that point where we're on our hands and knees and we don't think we can go anymore, then God comes down on our level and he says, I know it hurts, but don't quit. Don't give up on me. You promised me your best. Give me your best. I want to close with this. There's a lady in the Bible. We call her the persistent widow. How would you like that to be your name? Forever etched into the world. You get to heaven. Oh, you're the persistent widow. My name's Gladys, but yeah. But anyways, the story goes, I'm gonna give you the Cliff Note version for those of you old enough to know what Cliff Notes are. All right? Let's just say that this woman wants something, and in order to get that thing, she has to go and receive it from the master. But in order to have that given to her from the master, she's got to knock on the door, and the master's got to open it. And so she goes and she knocks on the door, and nothing happens. Next day she comes, she knocks on the door, and nothing happens. And let's just say, for the sake of this story, let's say she did it 100 times. When she went to the 100th time, she finally talked him into giving up. And he opens the door and says, "Fine, here." And it's a great story. When I was thinking about this, it's like, what if she would have stopped at 99? And then I took it a step further. How many times have I stopped at 99? Already. How many times have I given up on something that God had prepared for me when I was one knock away? How many times have you quit when at just the other side God says, look, don't give up. Here it is. You know, if we get to heaven and God shows us this timeline of events and he says, look at everything you could have had if you wouldn't have given up on me. And so the message today is that, you know, we're not selfish. We understand that it requires work. We cannot reap what we have not sown. You can't fake the harvest, and so we don't give up. I mean, that's it. I mean, if I wanted my students to know one thing, especially the ones that just graduated, that would be the message. Don't give up. Because there's going to be times in your life where you are going to want to. And the easy button says, do it. When things are hard, go find something easy. And if following Jesus Christ was easy, we wouldn't have all these warnings. If following Jesus Christ was easy, then we wouldn't have this example. Because that wasn't easy either. And if I was him, I'm just saying, I would have gave up before then. But he didn't. Don't give up. Don't give up. When it's hard, press on. He gets it. Let's pray. Father God, I just thank you so much for who you are. God, I thank you for never, ever, ever giving up on us. God, I thank you for messages that, like Paul gave us today. God, help us to put in the work. Help us to not try to deceive ourselves or others, or especially you. We understand that we cannot reap where we have not sown. And when it gets hard, God, help us to know that it's going to get hard. And when things hurt, help us to let it hurt. That sometimes pain is a requirement of growth. That sometimes pain is a requirement for the steps in our lives that you have in store for us later. And God, yes, I know we're busy and I know we have things in our lives, but help us to never use that as an excuse to do what you called us to do. And we can say like we sang a minute ago, yes, I will. God, we love you. We thank you so much for what you're doing in our lives. And I just pray that as a church and as individuals that we will not give up. And God, I thank you with all my heart that you didn't give up on us. In Jesus' name.